single white man ever said, I don't know enough about that topic to debate it, ever in 4 years. So that tells you something about entitlement, about what it means to be in a dominant group in society, right? And so, and you know, I'm a teacher, a professor, and it's only in the last 2 or 3 years in my classes that I've noticed women speak as much as men. Up until then, men spoke way more than women in the class, and that's with me, like a known feminist as the professor, right? So, you know, an infamous feminist, perhaps. So there's a cultural issue, right? I know even after 40 years of feminism, there's a cultural issue for why men get more involved in politics than women. But that's not enough to explain it, because in cultures that are much more patriarchal than our culture, much more patriarchal, there's more women in parliament, in the legislatures, right? Like in Africa, for example. So we've tried a lot of things, like during the Charlottetown Accord. Does everybody know what the Charlottetown Accord is? Yeah? Anybody not know? You don't know? Okay. During the at the end of the 1980s and early 1990s, Brian Mulroney tried to amend the Constitution so that Quebec would sign. And he had made 2 efforts to do that. One was the Meech Lake Accord and one was the Charlottetown Accord. The Meech Lake Accord was a very elite thing. It was the premiers that had to sign it, and there was a huge reaction against it, both from the women's movement in English Canada and from Aboriginal people, and from the West, who thought it was like special rights for Quebec. And in the Charlottetown Accord, because the women's movement had played a role in defeating the Meech Lake Accord, they decided to have, not just the women's movement, they decided that the reason that the Meech Lake Accord failed was because they left too many people out. They left women out, they left Aboriginal people out, and they left the West out. So in their typical brilliant strategy, they decided now they're going to include everybody. So they had self-government for Aboriginal people, they had stronger equality rights for women, and they had a Triple E Senate. Triple E equal, whatever it is, equal, effective. What's the third E? I can never remember.
Elected.
What? Elected, thank you, elected, thank you. So we decided, I was president of NAC at the time, that if there was going to be a Triple E Senate, we wanted a 4th E, which was equal. And we proposed 50% women, so that every, you know, if there were 4 senators, it would be 2 male, 2 female, right? And we went ahead, this is the only time we ever made any ground on the idea of quotas in Canada. And the reason that we made ground was everything else, we participated in these citizen conferences on the Charlottetown Accord, it wasn't called that yet, on these proposals. And a lot of our proposals, that is of the women's movement, labor movement, won in these citizens conferences, and we defeated a lot of the proposals of the government. But nevertheless, Mulroney was so desperate to pass this thing that he was willing to accept most of the changes that we had proposed. And one of the changes wasn't quotas, it wasn't the 2 and 2, but it was proportional representation, because you made an alliance with the right wing that was willing to support proportional representation, but not quotas. Anyway, though, to make a long story short, the premiers, when they met behind closed doors to consider the results of the citizens' conferences, and by the way, these citizens' conferences are something you should look at, maybe in another discussion, because it was the only genuinely democratic process I've ever participated in all my years in Canada. There were citizens' conferences, they were televised by Newsworld, there was politicians, academics, and activists from different movements, business people, and then there was a third of the delegates were selected randomly by lottery from people who applied to come. And they were ordinary citizens. And if any of you read my book, Imagine Democracy, you'll know that this experience of the citizens' conferences changed my approach to democracy, to the political process. Because what I saw was that, and this is what I think what you're saying too, is that when ordinary citizens get involved, and I heard Justin say it at the press conference, that it's not just a question of having organized groups like women's groups and unions and so on, which are important players. And really the only way that citizens have ever gotten involved in politics is through these kind of groups, right? Or social movement. But those groups have an agenda too, right? And they're advocates for an agenda. Whereas when ordinary citizens get involved, what I saw during the Charlottetown process was they're arguing for what they see as best in their community. And something happens in that process when ordinary citizens are involved, which is they change their mind. Like when you're in the political process, nobody ever changes their mind. It's a winner-take-all process. So if you're an advocacy group, you're fighting for a position. Even if somebody makes a good argument against your position, basically all you do is you'll consider the argument so you can get a strategy around it, so how you can defeat them. This is a sort of war notion, this military or sports notion of politics, right? Which is what's that term? It's not winsome. I should explain to you that I'm not at my top form because a friend of mine committed suicide on the weekend, and it was a pretty terrible experience. So I was in Montreal, and so anyway, I'm just not quite up to my usual.
You're doing great.
Thanks
speak.
for coming anyway.
Yeah, amazing,
Thank you.
amazing.
Thank you. So anyway, where was I? Oh yeah. Win some game, is that the right way to say it? But anyway, winner take all. It's a winner take all process. And so political debates like kabuki theater, people are convinced to back down if the consequences of not backing down are high enough. But nobody ever changes their mind. Whereas when there's citizens there, people change their mind. So all of a sudden the tone changes. Even us, we changed our tone because I suddenly realized, wow, I can actually persuade these people, And so I start to be more persuasive and less denunciating, or less speech making, right? So it's really, really changed my ideas about politics. And I started to look elsewhere, and I'm coming back to women in a minute. So I started to think, well, this is a different kind of process of politics. That these Charlottetown conferences were where citizens are actually engaged in the process. Now these were people who, they were interested in politics, so they had applied to come, but they hadn't been involved in politics, right? And I was thinking a lot about that, and what would it mean to have this political system that actually included citizens in some way in it. And then in 1995, I was asked to chair a meeting that Lula, who was at the time a presidential candidate, he was a leader of the Workers' Party in Brazil. Now he's a president of Brazil and has been, you probably heard of him, he's been president now for 2 terms. And he spoke about what the Workers' Party did when they came into power municipally in Brazil. And he spoke about engaging citizens and in participatory budgeting. How many people here have heard about participatory budgets? Okay, so I really highly recommend that you invite someone to talk to you about participatory budgets, because it started in Porto Alegre I'll do a little brief thing now, but I really think it's worth looking into. Because one of the things I know that, you've been talking about participation through education, which I think is important, but now there are actually institutions of participatory democracy that have been developed in Latin America, most especially, but also in Europe. And they work very well. And so participatory budgets is one of them. And this is ordinary, and this started in Porto Alegre with the new spending in the budget is decided by citizens, not a consultation process. They actually make the decision. And the way that it's organized isn't through just town hall meetings. Because in